and pose your question to the audience, please.
Thank you so much.
There we go.
There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Allison. My name is Adel Dalla. I work for an organization called the Center for Social Innovation, which provides space and services to over 1,000 social mission organizations. And I actually overachieved a little bit. I asked for permission for this. I have two questions. The first one is the question of who's not here, and specifically, what are we doing about that to ensure who's not here does be at the table and have a role at the table. And the second question I have is, how much patience do you have? We're talking a lot about the topic of impact. And then the topic of impact doesn't happen overnight. And so especially a lot of the work that we're doing is trying to figure out how do we have the patience to have impact while still negotiating between all our different stakeholders and complexities and players in order to do the work we want to do. So that would be my two questions.
Okay, who's ready? I have a microphone ready to be thrown. So do you want to start with one? Do you want to sort of maybe just be a bit, more targeted on the ones, and we'll go from there. Which question would you like them to answer first?
Oh, let's start with the first one.
Hey,
yeah.
Who's not in the room? Who are we missing?
Our bosses.
Oh, great. We didn't even need a microphone for our bosses. More government partners. Great. More employees, so people that are actually on the front line doing the work. I'm just hugging this thing now. I'm not actually throwing it, because by the time I throw it to you. Who else? And who would, so the answer was our largest critics, and who would be some of those largest critics? So what do we do right now to engage them, or do we engage them? So we hear about it after the fact as perceived failure. Does anybody have any thoughts on that or comments on that? Anybody dealt with one of those folks who, a little bit passive-aggressive and comes back to bite you? Really? Nobody's had any problems, really? Yes.
I'll just say I had a client not too long ago who called all this stuff fluffy. It's like, well, you got to show me the business case, show me the dollars and cents. All this stuff is fluffy. We're not a charity. That was the discussion.
Adele, do you want to talk about sort of how that's perceived, or
the fluffy piece? so much. So I think there's a limited viewpoint when people refer to things as fluffy, and what they're not seeing is the holistic picture of things. So, for example, organizations that are particularly diverse are particularly resilient and have the conditions for innovation, because it's usually in the diversity of those opinions and experiences that new and innovative ideas tend to emerge. There's a true business case to ensuring that everyone is at the table. There's a true business case to ensure the naysayers or the people who disagree are there with us, because truly we need to make sure all those voices are present in order to have the meaningful conversations so we all move forward. Into the conversation we had right before lunch, we cannot do that work in isolation. And so I believe it's actually in our collective best interest to do it.
But you have to make the hard business case, right? You got to, for some of those folks that, I remember CSR panels, we've all been going to these for many years, and it used to be, it's the nice thing to do. Diversity is good. It's a nice thing to do. And now it's like, it's the right thing to do. There's a solid business case, and yes, it's a nice thing to do. It was sort of the doing well by doing good kind of stuff is much more predominant. Do you want to move into your second question then? Just remind people what it was?
Sure. So the second question was, how much patience do you have in order to do the work that you're doing? And how do you negotiate with the fact that the work that we're all doing takes a very long time?
Yes. Well, I'm going to throw this to you just because I really want to.
I think by and large people have...
Speak right into it. Yeah.
Like hold it like...
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I think by and large people have a good amount of patience, but I think the main problem is the question in your mind of, are we doing this the right way? And how do we know? And if we're on the right path, then that adds more confidence. But if we're not, how do we know? And then how do we have that negotiation conversation with our stakeholders? So that's been my experience in the past, where you have all the patience in the world if you know you're getting to the right endpoint.
And that has to give some space to allow the fact that we may not be doing it the right way. Because a lot of the things that we're doing, if it was that easy to know there's one way and we're going to do it that way, then we wouldn't be in the situations we're in. So we have to give that space for risk.
Yep, you can do it, Ava.
Let's try this. Oh,
That's boring. Old school.
ruined all the fun. I actually appreciate that comment, and I have really low patience. And I think in the design of our program, actually, with Angela and Chris, we made a strategic decision to take the people that were ready and know that we know enough good principles about how not to screw it up and how to learn and move forward. But if we just kept talking, all we would do is talk. So I have low patience, which is a little bit informed just by my personality.
There is a balance. Like I have a deep sense of urgency to solve the things that we want to solve.
I like to call it.
And I think what I heard you say is if your organizational culture is one that is learning and listening, then we can avoid those constant conversations by ensuring that we're not making the same mistakes that we consistently make, and that we can be more accelerated in our investments and the risk-taking that we need to do.
So yeah, we need both this urgency, this sense of understanding the problem, resting in the ambiguity, really getting to understand it. But for those of us that have a propensity for action, we need to create sort of these safe places to try things out, to prototype and use some design thinking and all that other lovely stuff, because we need to hold both. I think as we think about this space, because we can't just keep talking, and yet we can't rush to action because we probably will do the wrong thing. So it's holding a little bit of both. And so
is how often do we factor patients into our project plans and our intents for activities? I think if you look at international development historically, it's just been an immense problem where there have yet to be concrete answers, because we want to be able to say, oh yes, we're going to do this in 2 years, when really it takes 3 or maybe it takes 5. So how do we be open and honest with ourselves in trying to define that, especially to our naysayers or those who may be willing to let us run with that ball a little bit, but under certain restrictions?
do you have an answer?
But I do have a thought that builds on what was just said, which is that, and it relates to an answer to your first question, Adil, which is who's missing in the room. I think that often we come to events where we're talking about making the world a better place, and we know that there are Indigenous communities here in Canada that obviously need to be a part of that conversation as well. And there's a lot of patience that I think we can learn from our fellow Indigenous Canadians. And, you know, the idea of thinking in 7 generations, you know, the idea of putting patience into your planning, you know, a lot of that is relationship building, because things happen when you have relationships with people. I'm learning these things too. I think that one really positive step is when we integrate traditions into the way we convene ourselves, and so providing a welcome that recognizes that we're all treaty people, I think, is an important part of creating a welcoming space. Even if we don't necessarily have Indigenous people in the room, I think that we're sending a signal that it's important to be building those safe spaces. So that's my contribution to how we can be increasing.
Thank you very much. You can just hold it until we get you to throw it to someone, if you wouldn't mind. Sure. Thank you. So Adil, anything you want to say in conclusion before we go on to our next question?
I just want to acknowledge my appreciation for that comment. And truthfully, when I asked that first question, that was the direction I was thinking about. There are many communities for various reasons who have suffered or been oppressed for many years, and they've had the patience to see other people work through the solutions. And so I do believe in the idea of extending that patience back. And then going to that question over there, this is potentially where the fluff comes in. But I think having the courage to have those courageous conversations that require us to talk about patience, to talk about where our blind spots are, is where we can all go in order to actually create the space for the work we're trying to do.
Thank you very much. Would you pass the microphone to Rachel, please? Thank you. Rachel, if you would introduce yourself and ask your question of the audience.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Rachel Madden, and I'm with the International Finance Corporation, which is the world's largest multilateral development bank focused exclusively on the private sector. We are a part of the World Bank Group. The World Bank, also known by its original name, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was created right after World War II to reconstruct Europe, and now focuses on poverty alleviation, and IFC was founded in 1956 to focus on the private sector's role in poverty alleviation. Just so you know, because I've been asked a lot what it is, so I've been really practicing. So my question, and it's interesting because it's sort of come up a little bit in this first discussion, is are we asking the right questions around impact and measurement of what we're trying to do? And I'm also thinking to some of the panels we heard this morning. For example, if the answer is 10,000 hours, what's the question, right? So, you know, I think a lot of times there can be misalignment with between the different partners and in an engagement because we haven't actually negotiated the question we're trying to answer. And I also come from an environmental background, and the thing that I heard over and over again really early on in my career is what gets measured gets managed. And I always wondered about that because I think that what gets measured is what is easy to measure. It's not necessarily the most impactful thing. So in all of that context, my question is, how do we ask better questions about what we're trying to measure and what we're actually trying to do?
Thank you. Thoughts on the misalignment? Lior, can you
answer the question, which is the right question to ask. But working on the corporate side, what I find is we don't necessarily, I'm going to generalize, and so if you are not in this bucket, certainly you're off the hook. We don't all speak the same language when it comes to the framework of measurement. So on the nonprofit side, if I talk about outcome versus output, everyone gets what I'm talking about. The corporate side, we just call everything impact. So how many volunteers showed up? Awesome. That was an amazing impact. 8 volunteers showed up. We changed the world. You know, it's sort of like that's the equation in sort of this field, in what is really a field of practice. And so, again, I don't have the solution, but I think they're in the field of community investment or social impact or sort of whatever you want to call it. We don't always take the time or have the patience to apply the kind of rigor we would to any other area of the business. And we certainly don't always speak the right language when it comes to how LBG or SIMPACT would sort of, or GRI would expect to measure and talk about this. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. Other thoughts?
So can I just, that's super interesting to me, something you just said, because you said we don't always apply the same rigor to this, which I think is so interesting in light of your comment around people see this as fluffy. So it almost becomes a self-perpetuating cycle in a way. And then I would say, what can we do to change that view from?
And so we're not willing to share or talk with other companies around what does impact actually mean in society and how can we actually work together to collectively identify what that impact we're all trying to achieve. And I personally, and don't hold this against Loyalty One, it's a very personal view, feel so bad for nonprofits and charities because all of us are going to them, asking them to fill out these unique impact reports, not asking them as the experts in society doing the work very locally what the impact actually means to them and the work that they're actually doing. We're all trying to interpret it in a different way.
Right. Do you have some thoughts? Yeah. I mean, we're really good at counting bums in seats, right? Oh, look how many people showed up. We'll throw that back to Stephanie if you wouldn't mind. But really, what is real and meaningful impact? It's a very difficult conversation, and therefore we don't often have it.
So my question is, is the issue that we're not rigorous in our measurement, or is the issue that we are not rigorous in our decision making? Because I would argue if we're rigorous in our decision making, we actually know at that point what it is we actually want to measure. And if there's a strong connection between the two, then you can actually make the measurement question more easily answered. And so my question to all of you is, if you truly believe that you are not rigorous in your decision making, then it makes the measurement piece difficult. In my experience, most people are rigorous in their decision making, but there's a disconnect between the decision making and the measurement piece.
the metrics actually. Thoughts are, what I often see in my own experience is, I'm going to connect this also back to kind of what Adil's question of who's not in the room. A lot of times we're not fully understanding the problem that we're trying to solve. And if we do understand the problem that we're trying to solve, actually taking the time to go into the communities who are affected by that problem and asking them, what are the questions that we need to ask? And I've seen scenarios where, for example, a bunch of people who are not Indigenous talking about Indigenous issues, and me having to put up my hand and say, wouldn't it make sense if we actually talk to the Indigenous community to find out, is this important to them? What are the things that they want us to measure? What are the most effective ways that we can measure it? And then also talking to other individuals who are in that space, whether it be community leaders or organizations who actually hold that knowledge really well, rather than us trying to put out these arbitrary goals or numbers of, well, we want to have X amount of volunteers, but what is the true impact? Are they learning? What do we want those volunteers, what is the experience that we want them to have, and what is the learning that we want them to have at the end of the volunteer experience, rather than them showing up, doing the hours, thinking about their grocery list and what they're going to watch on Netflix the whole time, and then leaving, not really having achieved what we wanted to achieve.
Thank you.
So I think that is so valuable, the way that you contextualize that, because I think that's where the private sector can really do such a better job in applying business thinking to these problems. Because if you're a business and you have a marketing problem, you want to enter a new market, do you just go into a room somewhere and go, I think we should, launch these 6 new products that I have sitting in my closet next week, and we're all just going to do it, right? No, you don't do that. You sit around, you do your market research, you bring in all of the experts, you go out, you talk to potential customers, you do focus groups, you apply all of this big business thinking, and then somehow, at least in my experience, it's as though that thinking is taken out of the equation when we want to actually support a community. It becomes a completely different conversation to which that rigor is not applied for no real reason. I don't have the answer to why that happens. But I think that if we did apply that rigor of what are we trying to achieve, who's our customer, if it's easier to think of it that way, and then if they were our customer, what kinds of questions would we ask them, and then just apply that same process to a different population, I think we could get really, really much better impact, and I think address a lot of the issues that you just brought up as well.
Any other thoughts on this before we move to
Eric Sarvella, independent consultant. Talking about impact and establishing really what the expectations are, I always equate this back to a breakfast club. And is the impact how many kids you have fed through the club? Or is it about how many of you fed and then what was the change in grades as a result of having a hot breakfast? Over what period of time? What sort of barriers did they overcome to achieve this? Is it then going into high school, going into post-secondary education? So when you start thinking about impact, it's over what time frame and really what are those expectations that you're...
Our biggest thing is being in communities for a long period of time. So sometimes every year we are engaging 20 students in a specific community, but it's the same students. They came back and we're still growing with them. And that level or depth of immersion is something that's valid. It's harder to measure. And I think another 2 more points is it's hard to measure without being too invasive. Sometimes some of our kids don't want to take pictures, and we have to respect that, but that doesn't mean we're not doing good work. Like, we promise there's a kid over there that's actually benefiting from this. We just can't really show you their face because they don't want to do that right now. And to be able to have those conversations, and what does that look like? What does accountability look like with respecting community spaces? And I think the third thing, when it comes to measuring impact and looking at measurement is if funders or sponsors would like a certain level of impact to be measured, then they need to invest in what that measurement looks like. And sometimes that measurement goes beyond a budget line. Sometimes it goes perhaps I can actually show you the level of evaluation that I'd like, and perhaps I could give you some in-kind support on how you might go about measuring this in your communities. I know I'm a scientist, we work with teams of scientists, so evaluation is not a problem for us. Some of our other community counterparts, we find that it is a problem, simply because sometimes being in that space and not having the actual skills to do that is difficult, and not knowing how to integrate that into the fabric of your programming is difficult. And then you thereby lose funding, not because you're not making an impact, because you just don't know how to measure it. So just being able to think about those things as well.
Just hold on. Thank you. Did you want to say anything to wrap us up? Okay, terrific. Thank you all very much. Yeah, this is a great discussion, and it's not easy. I'm currently involved in, okay, you ready? Is everybody sitting down? This is the name of this task force. The Social Innovation and Social Finance Strategy Co-Creation Steering Group of ESCC Canada. I won't even spell out ESCC. So we're trying to develop a social innovation and social finance strategy for Canada in a co-creation system with government. Super easy. They've got the words, but they don't actually know how to do it. So part of this stuff, when we think about, how do we work with our funders differently, the opportunity to do co-creation, although it's very hard, is the only way we're going to get through this. So it's actually real and meaningful impact. Because if you're not learning and doing better, what's the point, right? And so so it's a different form of engagement. Not easy, but really important. So Mark is going to go next. First, he'll introduce himself.
My name is Mark Sarner. My voice doesn't work. I'm the founder of Manifest Communications. We have been devoted since 1981 to social change, and that's all we've ever done. We work with clients in all three sectors, and the thing that's directly relevant to this session is our history of involvement in partnerships between the corporate and the NGO world. We did the first book on it. We do it since forever. So over a period of, say, 30 years, I've had a lot of experience on both sides trying to make these things work, which leads me to my question. Why don't partnerships work?
A lot of it comes down to expectations in terms of what one organization wants to achieve versus the other, whether an NGO's goals are aligned with what what a company's trying to achieve, and the level of compromise that's involved in trying to make that whole thing work, whether compromise is okay. So it comes down to what degree. And then I think what we're seeing more and more now is this whole kind of accountability mechanism that's in place, where we see companies looking for more information from companies around the dollars that are spent in certain initiatives to help them be able to later articulate the impact or output or whatever we want to call it. And if we do have small organizations, then they don't always have the ability to do that in a way that may meet the needs and expectations of those sponsoring companies. Those are a few things.
Mark, do you want to comment on that?
I think that's dead accurate. I think that expectations are important. Everybody starts off with good intentions, but that doesn't usually result in the kind of results that either party was hoping for. I think that's very, very significant for sure. I think one of the things that happens, just in my observation, is a question of timing. Nonprofits approach companies essentially for money, and they do it quite late. They have something specific they are selling. The company is actually, talking about difference, is actually not ideally in a position to respond to what is being pitched, but it's very late in the game for the nonprofit, and they're very motivated to get the money so they can do what they want to do. They want to say the right things, they want to look the right way, and companies, I think, are looking at things in a more deliberate, more strategic way. So the conversation starts way, way too late for a good relationship to develop, and it's a relationship versus a transaction. And very often the NGO is actually only driven to a transaction, and they want that resource commitment now. And the company thinks differently and approaches problems differently. So I think that's one of the basic problems with expectations, and it relates to when the conversation starts and about what.
Next, I think there's a series of, actually, why don't you go to your table mate and then we'll throw it over.
Hi, my name is Jake. I work at Simpact, and I think one thing that we talked about earlier was vulnerability in the workplace and how people don't want to seem vulnerable. And so we're talking about partnerships and also about not knowing what you don't know and how some people don't know what they don't know. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of experience, so I don't know a lot about it, but from what I've been thinking, a lot of companies would go into these situations and they are obviously competitive with each other. They want to pretend like they know these things and make these assumptions without asking other people. So I think it's almost this fear to be vulnerable and say, actually, I don't understand this and I need help with that. And I think, like you talked about before, that's why companies are hesitant to ask for help, even though they can apply it in different situations with the market research. But they don't want to admit that in this certain area, they're not as knowledgeable about it. So I think that's one way to overcome it. And then in terms of partnerships, if you're working with a non-for-profit, acknowledging what their strengths are, what they know, and then acknowledging your strength and your own weaknesses, and then building off of that instead of having a competitive nature to the relationship.
If I can respond to that in maybe a bit of a different perspective, I don't actually find that. And this room is evidence of it. Yes, people are competitive corporately, but in this world, there's a remarkable level of collegiality. People talk to each other, they talk to other competitors and so on, and actually they do look for answers. One of the places they look for answers is to the NGO. Let's say I'm interested in hunger, less hunger in my community. The natural thing to do is to listen to or go to an organization that deals with hunger, for example, the local food bank, and asking them, we're not experts in this, we're in the widget business, so you're the experts, what should we do? Now, the answer almost invariably, and again, I want to say this isn't always the case, but very, very often there are one of two answers. Either, what do you want to do? And the company says, and the NGO says, oh, well, we'll do that, even though they won't. The other is, we're the answer and we need more money. If we have more money, we will deliver more service and that will solve the problem. To be honest, that's very rarely the case. More services are delivered and those are nice, and the NGOs are well-intentioned. But there's a difference between delivering more social services and actually achieving social change. And so the question gets asked properly by the company, but doesn't get answered by the perceived expert, because the perceived expert actually may or may not be an expert, but is primarily motivated by keeping their doors open and looking for resources to keep that happening. So there's a huge disconnect there, and that creates a lot of problems.
Who has the bot? Yeah, can you please? Versus Canada. So I come from the fluffy side. Instead of saying why do partnerships don't work, I think we should focus on the strengths and say why do partnerships work. I know it's all about relationships and kind of that's my thing. And I can say from experience working, for example, with an organization for 53 years, it's definitely about, 53 years with an organization partnered with Cystic Fibrosis Canada. It is all about relationship. So we look at what are the strengths of the partnership and how can we build on it. And when we now get new corporations, it's how can we help you help us as well. So how can we make this a partnership rather than just a transactional piece?
Do you want to comment?
Right on.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad that you hadn't had that partnership for 53 years because I thought you were looking good for having that partnership.
I was going to say, I realized that. I'm like, oh, wait, no.
Up here we have a
comment that you just made. If a corporate or somebody is trying to drive some bigger systemic social change, and if you go to a nonprofit who you perceive to be, or a group of nonprofits who you perceive to be more expert than you, because at least they're working in the community and working on that problem, but they have a different, maybe not aligned set of interests because, they've got their model of change. that seems to me something that will just kind of continue to be a cycle that goes on. How do you break that cycle? Who do you find to inform the right kind of intervention, and how do you identify then the right partners to do that?
I'm going to say something maybe a bit provocative for those NGOs that are in the room, but
unusual for Mark.
Yeah, you don't know me, but anyway. It's in my experience, it is the exception that the charity or nonprofit organization has either the orientation or the skills to answer that question. There are people out there, we're one group, but there are others who have the knowledge and expertise to work with the corporation to help them design and then develop and manage effective partnerships against a bigger systemic change issue. And the interesting thing is the sector needs corporations to think differently about their role and to act differently in relation to their connection to the social, to generating more social good. Companies don't have to become charities, and they won't, but they do have to understand the most effective way for them to be good partners. And talk about helping me help you. There's a corporate side where you can help the NGO grow and refine and get better, because the sector has to change in fundamental ways in order to be effective. I would argue that social change not happening enough or fast enough or in a sustained way is not a result of an inadequate amount of money being in charities. It isn't simply. I'm not saying money doesn't count, but it's not a money question, and it isn't a matter of doing the same thing except in red, or doing the same thing except louder, or doing more of what you already do. Not that those things can't be good, but when you're talking about systemic change, which ironically could lead to putting the NGO out of business if it's successful, that's hard for an organization to get its head around and think about differently given its allocation of resources, its need for money. There's a bunch of factors that influence how they think. And I'm saying this with love. This is not, I'm not being critical. I know these people. I've worked with them all my life, and I love them, and I think it's all great. But many of them are operating in a very last century mode, and it's time to get with this one. And companies in many cases are further ahead in their thinking, ironically, than the charitable sector. For years, the charitable sector complained that companies didn't pay enough attention to the social good. They didn't give it enough money, they didn't give it enough priority, they didn't really engage, and all they did was write checks, and they gave a little bit of money to a lot. Well, those days are changed, if not gone, and companies are paying attention. You got to be careful what you wish for. Now they have expectations that the charitable sector often has trouble understanding, and they have accountability requirements that the sector is not used to meeting in terms of that type of funder and supporter. So it's interesting times, it's challenging times, it's transition time, and some are great and some are right with it. It sounds like cystic fibrosis is right there from what this lady was saying. But overall, of the 150 or 60,000 charitable nonprofits in this country, it's still a relatively small number that are out front.
As the Associate Vice President of Partnership Development and Donor Relations at Kids Help Phone, I'd like to say I believe that we actually do approach people well in advance with great ideas. My first question is, what is your objective? What do you want to accomplish? What are your values? How can we work together to help you achieve your business objectives? Because if we're not able to do that through employee retention, through driving more customers to your stores, to your business, to help you become employer of choice, then we're not helping ourselves. in a corporate environment. That's my 2 cents.
We are working with these guys, so that's nice. But I just want to say something. We are dealing, and somebody said this earlier, one of the challenges we have is these are two sectors that live in different countries. Okay.
Well, Mark, I'm going to hold you there because if there's time, I'm going to come back to you on that, and I want to give David a chance, but I can't let this one go. So here's my issue super quickly. I don't think one sector caused all our challenges. I don't think one sector is going to solve all our challenges. What we need to do is create space for cross-sectoral collaboration, apropos the SDGs, that gives us an opportunity to redefine these challenges that go beyond social service provision. But if we don't break the cycle of looking at how we understand those challenges differently and getting to new forms of solutions by engaging not only the NGOs, the corporate government, because policy is a huge lever here, Mark is a huge lever, behavior change is a huge lever. Until we get those all together, we won't get to the level of culture change that we need. So what I need is more spaces for that intersectoral collaboration to happen. And thank you. Okay, and I'm going to throw it to David. Thank you. David, could you please introduce yourself and tell us what your question is for the audience?
I had a single question. Now I have lots of questions. But my name is David Clemens, and I'm currently working on a project in Colombia called Blending Capitals for Peace. And I'm doing that under the auspices of Voluntourism and the BC Lab in Colombia. After 50 years of civil war in that country, we think it's about time for some peace. So that's my focus, and my question has actually changed since I've had such a chance to listen to everyone. We talked about something called ROI earlier today. Can someone tell me if we change the I from investment to integration, what might happen? Would we see that we're actually investing in ourselves as corporations, as individuals? Because it seems like we've been able to put the onus out there that it's something that's separate, that dealing with the world's challenges are over there. So that's my question for the audience is, if we change investment to integration, how might the conversation change?
I love your question because it touches on the answer that I wanted to do to the conversation prior. When we're looking at this conversation, change does not happen in isolation, yet when we look for solutions, we tend to look at it in a linear path or in that isolated relationship. Why are we measuring impact? Why are we investing in these programs? At the end of the day, it's because it's the beneficiary. The employers want to engage their employees who will go volunteer at Kids Help Phone or the nonprofit. The nonprofit needs that volunteer and wants to retain them beyond that program. At the end of the day, what we both share is the same beneficiary and purpose, but we don't talk about how we're making the experience better for them. We're getting stuck in kind of the administrative conversations, and we forget that point of the individual and how their role in the conversation of the impact and program comes into play. And I think it's important that when we look at these relationships that we do look at integration. How can we work together to collectively engage and retain the talent that we're both trying to recruit?
Thank you. Anyone else have a thought? Return on integration?
Do you want to ask one of your other questions, David?
I'll hold. Thank you.
Great. So I have a little exercise for you. So I'm so sorry, I didn't really introduce myself. I'm right there. My name is Allison Hewitt. I am the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation Senior Fellow in Social Innovation, and I work at the Mars Discovery District here in Toronto, leading the social innovation programs there for 10 years. And I'm also currently the thinker in residence for South Australia. I just came back on Thursday night, and one of the things they do in South Australia is no meeting. If it's 3 people, if it's a meeting like this, starts without acknowledgement to country. No meeting. So it is one of the things that we can maybe think about doing here as well. Okay, I have a quick question for you. If I ask you, stereotypically, When I say nonprofit or NGO, what comes to mind? Please just shout it out. You don't even need the mic. So, charity. Okay. Keep doers. Goodwill. Okay, you guys are really doing this wrong. For stereotypes, this is awesome. You guys, okay, so good charities, doers, goodwill. Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Let's go over to the corporate side. Money? Demand. Yeah, keep going. I need 2 more. Okay. Scale. Okay, I just got 5, just to manage time here. Okay. What's the opposite of charities? Opposite of charities? What's the opposite of charities? For profit. Okay, what's the opposite of doers? What's the opposite of goodwill? Pardon? Bad faith. Grassroots? Top down. And credibility. Anybody a little bit? Liars. Liars. Okay, let's go with that. More fun. Okay, great. Let's go with the opposite of money. Profit. Loss. Demanding. Great. Fast-paced. And scale. About like small or micro or something. Is that okay? Okay, now if you were working in the charity or NGO space, how would you describe your work? So we've got charities on one side, for-profits on the other. How would you describe what it is you do that sort of falls in between this or owns this in a different way? What do you do if you're working in those places? Okay, I'm just going to stay with this. So between sort of doers and slackers, how would you own that differently in that sector? Perfect. Goodwill versus bad faith? Grassroots and top-down? Pardon? Collaborative. And credibility versus liars. Okay, let's do it over here. Same thing. So between sort of in the corporate, you work in the corporate. So between sort of money and broke, how would you describe what you do? So sustainability, great. Like the business model, right? Okay. Between profit and loss, how would you describe this, what you're doing? Great. Demanding and fluffy. I feel like there's a cat story happening here somewhere. Break even. And between fast-paced and slow? Methodical. And finally, between scale and small. Ready? It could be growth, which is here, but if you're sort of thinking about what, you know what, I'm going to say growth because I think that's really super important. What often happens when I do this exercise is people are much more stereotypically negative about each of them, and then they play around with it. But what happens in the world, we see us and them. We see right and wrong. We see black and white. But in fact, the world doesn't work that way. What we're intending to do, and in the world of innovation, we actually need to hold both these paradoxes. We need to do an empathy-building exercise so that we understand how people who are working in those sectors understand the challenges that they're facing and what they're dealing with. There are real issues that all of us have around transparency and accountability and what we need to do. And so part of our job that we need to do in the world of innovation is to hold the paradox, to do a deep understanding of what they are and work with them. And that's where the innovation is going to come. It's not from the right and the wrong and the yes and the no, but it's holding both of those. And you call that polarity. Can you talk about that for a second while I sit down?
Yeah, talk about polarity. Dr. Barry Johnson in 1992 wrote a book called Polarity Management. Some of you may be familiar with it, but basically what he suggested is that we live in a world where we're not here to solve problems, we're here to manage polarities. And the reason being that all of us exhale and inhale. If we tried to just focus on the exhaling, that'd be kind of tough. If we just focused on the inhaling, eventually that would get difficult as well. So when we look at the problems that we're trying to solve in the world, to think of them as really polarities to be managed, we're not going to solve the problems of a species that has 7.5 billion of its expressions on the planet. If we think we're going to solve problems, then we really are going to run into a problem. So if we can just think about these things from the standpoint of how we can hold things like diversity and inclusivity in our two hands and juggle those things and move back and forth between those, then we can begin to understand things like integration and innovation and these other things that we've been talking about. And we can move from I or you to we and us. And I think that's really what we're trying to get to in our discussion today is how do we really see community partners not necessarily as others, but how do we begin to see them as part of what it is that we actually are doing, whether we're corporations, whether we're NGOs, whatever it is that we self-identify with. And how do we begin to see that? And I think that's when we can do things like take a multi-capital perspective on the world around us and see all these assets that we have access to. I haven't heard one question today or even one discussion that my ears have come across where someone has been talking about money. Now, I know that somewhere in our minds, financial capital is something that we're all interested in, but the things that seem to be more alive in the space today are things like our bonding social capital and our bridging social capital. These things are important for us to recognize. Human capital, intellectual capital, cultural capital, political capital. These things are actually vastly more important to the integration of the whole than, say, financial capital. Yes, financial capital may provide some grease for those other things to have a place, but this is where we want to start that conversation.
I fully agree with you. There should be this, or at least I believe there should be a concept of return on integration. And this really, in my mind, relates back to what Mark was talking about with regards to partnership. Because it's only when we can be able to identify our return on integration that we know that the partnership may have been successful. If we don't do that, and perhaps we use language like investment, we start to think independently. We don't think we think you and I. So I think really to answer your question in some way, why don't we start using words like integration? Perhaps they're even more clearly defined than the word partnership. I think that was my other point. In my experiences, and 80% of 90% of my time, I broker partnerships. I teach people, train people on partnerships. I support and advise different organizations in partnerships. I would say almost all of the time, people have different perceptions of what the word means. Sometimes it's a noun, sometimes it's a verb, sometimes it's a destination, sometimes it's a journey. If you don't clarify these things at the beginning of any great potential partnership, you won't lead yourself to a return on integration.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and so what I'd like to do is start with Rachel, Adele, and then we'll end with Mark in terms of your thoughts on any of the things. Rachel, and you've got some interesting thoughts on scale you might want to talk about. I'd be really interested in hearing maybe a successful partnership, and then we'll give Mark the last words. We've only got 5 minutes, though.
So just thinking about the conversation that we've been having, and as this conversation is a continuation of all the conversations of the morning, I think one of the things that I think about a lot, because IFC is a global international organization with a very strong convening power, is what does it really mean to scale our impact? And someone on this panel, it might have been Mark, said, does it mean I do the same thing but I just do more? And I mean, I think none of us would say that that's the answer. But if that's not, then what is? And so the thing that I seek to find in the engagements that I'm building right now are what's the combination of people and partners and situation that will take something from a one-to-one engagement from a one-to-many, so that rather than having a linear growth, we have an exponential one. And those are much harder to find, much harder to do, and they take a lot more patience. So I invite any of you to join me in that conversation later on. There's my pitch. But yeah, those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about in today.
Thank you.
So you asked about successful partnerships. So
Something you'd like to talk about to sum up.
okay, I think I can cover that and some other piece I wanted to get in, which is one of the things that we're doing a lot right now. We've actually had a lot of different types of partnerships over the years, but something that's really topical now, especially as it relates to the conversation today in community investment, is we started with a number of folks in our community a program called How to Be an Ally. And the purpose of the program is a workshop series to provide education and the opportunity to learn and engage on ideas on allyship for communities like Indigenous communities, Black communities, LGBTQ2S communities, and so on. And the reason why that came to mind as a kind of a final point is the kind of pyramid of impact is really fascinating. In this scenario, we as a nonprofit benefit from being able to host this programming. The key person who actually, where a lot of the money actually goes to, is the person from the marginalized community who's doing the training. That person, along with us, are providing training for free to people in the community and for people in the organizations that are partnering with us. And the reason why I wanted to end on this point is because the reason why I think that this really works is because it actually speaks to the values and the needs of the organization that is sponsoring or partnering with us on this project. The inspiration came from a lot of corporate entities coming to us saying, how do we do this training? We actually need this within our organization. And we were able to figure out a model that supports their existing needs and allows us to actually use some of that funding as well to create community impact all around. And so that's what I think right now is really interesting. How do we get outside the fluff? Well, we actually address the real problems through community investment.
Thank you. Mark.
I asked the question, why don't partnerships work? Let me talk to you about some things that can really make partnerships very powerful. Two ways of looking at the world. One, backwards. We tend to look at things forwards, backwards. Number two, how we think. We have a tendency to think inside out. We have to think outside in. I know I'm challenging the name of this conference, but backwards planning, backwards thinking. I mean, this is really critical. There are a few things to keep in mind as general principles in terms of building an effective partnership, and I'm going to be quick.
Okay.
Number one, common ground. We have to have common ground. Allison's exercise was a perfect example of how you try and actually establish common ground. Second, a common lens. You have to be looking at the world through a single lens that will refract the world in a way that you can see it from both sides. Very, very important. One key to that is having a good theory, a theory of change and how it happens. Very, very important, very rarely ever discussed. Okay? Number three, common cause. You have to be united in support of the particular cause that you're on about. That's really key. Number three, common commitment. Partnerships bring resources to the table and hopefully are synergistic. everybody at the table has to bring to the table what they're willing to share to make things good. Finally, and maybe most important, common sense. We tend to beat our chests in favor of big, hairy goals. They're exciting. They're stimulating. They really work to a certain point for a very short moment. Get real. Very, very real. That will result in, I think, good working relationships that will produce results over time.
Thank you. I would just close by saying thank you for sharing your wisdom. I'm a big believer in the wisdom of the crowd, and obviously we've got a lot of it here today. I would urge you to think on multiple scales that we have real and immediate problems. We have hungry people. We have people that need shelter. There's a portion of the work, the funding, that needs to go to alleviating suffering. It is good. It is noble. It's what needs to happen. But if you want to get to real systemic change, you have to think differently in a co-created partnership kind of way, from the academic rigor to the policy folks to the market solutions to how we get to behavior change. We need to create those kind of spaces. So I would urge you to think with your feet in the ground and your hand reaching for the stars, because we actually need to do both. And thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.